We are back. It's the Joe Holka Show presented by Line Movement. Thanksgiving. I'm thankful for each and every one of you who clicked this video, of course. So I'm going to do a bonus breakdown this week. DraftKings Showdown. Of course. Is there anything better than showdown slates on Thanksgiving outside of all of the late swaps and classic slates you have going on in your portfolio? Let's make sure you guys are ready for the showdown contest for sure. We have 3 awesome slates to get to for Thanksgiving, but before we do that, if this is your first time here, would love it if you would consider subscribing to the channel. Of course, while you're at it, smash that like button, hit the bell so you don't miss anything along the way. Let's get right into the picks. All right, guys, like I said, we're going to go through each game on the Thanksgiving slate from a showdown perspective. If you think I missed anything along the way, definitely come join us on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern time. Going to walk through all these games again with you guys, with the community live on stream. Don't normally do a Thursday stream, but for Thanksgiving, I think we need to do it. But we are going to fly through these games. I'll go through some of my favorite captains, some of my favorite value plays, and just give my thoughts on these games as a whole. So this first one, Houston at Detroit. Houston 3-7, Detroit 4-6. Not two amazing football teams overall, but definitely interesting from a fantasy perspective. The opening line has the Texans as 2.5-point favorites on the road. The over and under is at 52 points. So what was interesting about this game overall, at least early in the week, is that a lot of sharp action was coming in on Detroit originally. So I think that's kind of a different thing that we'll see from the sharps at times, because betting against the public after a team just has a really poor game overall. So I think that part of it is interesting. The other part of this is just looking at the game environment in general. Neither one of these defensive lines really do a very good job at pressuring the quarterback. So Desean Watson, Matt Stafford going to have a little bit more time than usual. Houston, obviously, we know they want to play kind of an up-tempo game, 8th fastest neutral pace overall. So let's talk about a couple guys on the Houston side first that I think are viable captains. We can start at the top with Desean Watson. Obviously, he's very, very expensive, but we talked about this last week in the matchup against the New England Patriots. These running quarterbacks, guys, man coverage is very important. So these defenses that play a lot of it, New England, number 1 in the league in man coverage. Detroit, number 2 in the league at man coverage. So the reason that it's important for these rushing quarterbacks, it's much easier to run when a defense is facing away from you in man coverage as opposed to in zone, where they're kind of sitting there with their eyes on the quarterback the entire time. So last week against the Patriots, we see him rush in a touchdown. We see him have about 35 yards on the ground. So I think that this is still a spot where the ceiling is definitely a little bit higher for Watson on the ground. So I love him this week. I definitely think pretty easy to pair him with his guys Fuller and Cooks. So between Fuller and Cooks, this is where it gets a little bit interesting on the slate. I like both of them for the record, but let's start with Brandon Cooks, because I think this guy is still just getting a little bit, I was going to say underappreciated, undervalued, but I think people understand now that he does have the ceiling, but the floor is what's been really impressive so far this year since they got rid of their coach and GM. So Brandon Cooks, no one in this game has a higher weighted opportunity rating than Cooks over the last 4. So weighted opportunity rating, that's the metric we talk about a lot. It's a mixture of air yards and market share of targets. So shout out to Josh Hermsmeyer, one of the most predictive wide receiver metrics there is. So number 1 on the slate. He's also the 4th highest price player now, which obviously makes some sense. Only Will Fuller, a higher yards per route run over that time period as well. But Cook's a little bit of a discount off of Will Fuller. So if we go over to Will Fuller, we know he's going to be that kind of deep threat overall, that preeminent deep threat on this offense. But Cook, definitely a more reliable usage tree, but the ceiling for Fuller is huge. He does have the 2nd highest weighted opportunity rating, does have the number 1 yards per route run, so 2 very predictive metrics. Obviously, I think that since Fuller doesn't really go off last week in a week where Watson had over 300 yards passing and did have a really good game overall, I think that people might be looking to Cooks overall. So maybe Fuller comes in at a little bit lower ownership than he should. So if you didn't want to go with a Desean Watson captain, I honestly think it's fine to go with either Fuller or Cooks in the captain spot as well. A lot of times you'll see ownership condense on these quarterback plays, especially if you're playing a larger field. I like the idea of getting in one of these high upside wide receivers overall. So those would be my favorite plays, obviously on the Houston side. Probably no surprise there overall. If we move down the salary spectrum a little bit, I do have some interest in Duke Johnson, and I think we'll have some sprinkled in throughout our lineups just because the matchup is so strong overall. Only 5 teams have faced a higher opponent rush play rate than the Lions this year. The Lions also have allowed the 3rd most running back yards on the rushing side of things, the 2nd most running back receiving yards, and also the most running back touchdowns. So that's really interesting overall. They just can't defend the run. They can't defend running backs in the passing game either. The problem is Duke Johnson, they're just not checking the ball down to him. Desean Watson would rather run. So I think the volume overall, I think there's some volatility here. Only 13.5 touches per game over the last 2 games. He did touch the ball 20 times in week 9. So Duke Johnson feels a little bit too expensive to me because I do think he's going to have some ownership here overall and just people attacking this matchup. So I think I want to be on the passing game, or at least overweight on the passing game here. But Duke Johnson's fine. 7,800, a little bit of a steep price tag. If we wanted to go down and talk about these tight ends a little bit, I don't have a ton of interest in Darren Fells, even though he's only 2,700 on the slate, or 2,600, sorry. Hasn't seen more than 3 targets since the middle of October. I just don't think there's much ceiling here overall at his price, where you're basically just praying for a touchdown. Akins, on the other hand, a little bit more expensive, 5,600, but he is someone that just had a career high in receiving yards last week on 6 targets, 83 yards against the Patriots. So he does have the 3rd highest target per route run on the slate. Only Andrews and Hawkinson on this Thanksgiving slate have a higher target per route run, a very predictive metric for tight ends in general. So I think if you didn't want to go that direction, the only other guy that I'm kind of looking at on the wide receiver side of things on the Houston side, Kiki QT, 3,400, saw 4 targets last week. 3 of those did come in the red zone where he did score. So I think if you're really just praying for a touchdown, I think I prefer Kiki versus one of these tight ends overall. Moving over to the Detroit side of the ball, I definitely see myself having probably more 4-2 stacks in favor of Houston, maybe a couple of 5-1 onslaughts, but the Detroit side is just really interesting overall. Like, you can say what you want about Stafford. Obviously, he's a little bit banged up. They just have so many injuries. So at the time of this recording, Kenny Golladay, DeAndre Swift, Danny Amendola, still TBD if they're going to be in this game overall. So if they do, I actually think all of those guys, Kenny Golladay, Swift, and Amendola, very underpriced relative to their opportunity that they should be seeing. And people might be scared to roster them coming off of this injury. So I always think there's some value from an ownership perspective when it comes to that. If we just look at Marvin Jones, 7,400 for him, despite being without Kenny Golladay, Amendola, and Swift, Jones gets 6 targets against the Panthers. So it just seems like this offense as a whole is just so unpredictable. So I think it's a better matchup for the run game on both sides of the ball, actually. But it is a decent spot if we want to look at the wide receiver matchup for these Detroit pass catchers. So one of just 3 teams who's allowed a 71+% completion rate to wide receivers is Houston on the other side of this game. So I think that Marvin Jones is still interesting at 7,400. You're going to be looking at him versus guys like Duke Johnson in that range. So I think he's at least reasonable if you want to have some guys coming back on the other side of those Houston heavy stacks. TJ Hawkinson's the other one, probably viable no matter what, honestly. But what's interesting about him is I think he just has so much I think he's so much more tied to touchdowns in terms of his ceiling than a lot of these other guys. That like that, his best bet, especially if at least 1 or 2 of these guys come back, is that he just scores multiple touchdowns to be like that top guy on the slate that you need in the optimal lineup at that price, right? So I don't love the price in general, don't love the ceiling. So I think I'm probably going to be underweight on the Hawkinson situation overall. One other guy that I think is interesting, Marvin Hall, obviously playing that Golladay role. So if Golladay misses again, you just get this guy 14.6 ADOT over the last 4 games. Stafford is going to take a few deep shots for sure. Marvin Hall's snap rates, solid, all of that. It just seems like at 4,600, might be a little bit of a steep price tag for a few deep targets, but definitely the more valuable type of targets we want at the lower end of the pricing spectrum. I guess the only guys we haven't really talked about in this game. So say Swift is not able to suit up, and we're looking at these Detroit running backs. The Texans, 32nd in DVOA against the run, 32nd in yards allowed per carry. So it's just kind of one of these spots, though, with Detroit where Matt Patricia is just so like unpredictable with the running back usage. Like obviously going back to Belichick and New England, those like you never really knew what you were going to get from the revolving door that it was there. So I think it's kind of similar in Detroit right now without Swift. Carry on last week, 6 rush attempts, 5 targets. Adrian Peterson, 7 rush attempts, 1 target. So it feels kind of like a stay away overall for me, despite the matchup. All right, just to tie a bow on this game, I think the captain plays for me: Watson, Cooks, Fuller, maybe a sprinkle of Stafford on the few heavy Detroit stacks that I will have. One guy that I forgot to mention on the value side of things, Jamal Agnew, saw 6 targets last week, which he turned into only 3 receptions and 10 yards, but he's only $800. So I think that if he's going to be on the field, again, if we see all these injuries on the Detroit side of the ball, it's not a terrible route to go on the Detroit side just to kind of punt it off with a guy that's at least going to be on the field. People were asking about Kenny Stills. He's very cheap as well. He did leave week 11 with an injury and did not return. He might have an outside shot of playing in this game, but I honestly still think Kiki would be the better option overall, with Randall Cobb still likely out with that toe injury. So from a value perspective, the Kiki side of things, maybe Agnew for a very cheap 800 price tag, but still trying to figure out if we get any of these Golladay, Swift, Amendola types back. I'm super interested in going there where people might be a little bit scared off of the injury. Marvin Hall, another value guy that I really like, and kind of taking a stand, I guess, against the matchups just being so strong in the running game on both sides. I don't love the running back situation in Detroit. I think I'm probably going to be underweight on Duke Johnson. All right, moving on to game number 2. Definitely an interesting one overall as well. Washington at Dallas. Both teams are 3-7. Opening line here just has the Cowboys at home being a 1-point favorite. Only a 47-point over-under. A lot of sharp action coming in on Dallas so far. 74% of the money, 61% of the bets. One thing that I kind of keep coming back to here, though, is the divisional game unders just tends to happen a lot. One thing that would be one of my biggest concerns from a game environment perspective is just this Dallas offensive line, probably bottom 5, bottom 8, even though they're getting a little bit healthier, against this Washington defensive line that's arguably top 3 in the league. There's going to be a ton of pressure on Andy Dalton in this spot, and that's not something that he's done very well with in the past. So Dallas, the upside of Dallas overall in these games is they do have the second fastest neutral pace of any team in the NFL. Washington kind of middle of the pack. So if they can kind of play this game the way they want to, maybe there would be a little bit of pace to it overall. So if we're just looking at some of the top captains, I think both quarterbacks are totally fine. You guys know me, I try and get away from the quarterback captains in some of the larger field tournaments just because you can get a little bit more of an ownership discount. One guy you probably won't get much of a discount on, let's start with the Washington side of the ball, and let's start with Terry McLaurin. So Terry McLaurin leads the slate in weighted opportunity, 0.69 over the last 4 games. Obviously just getting those valuable targets downfield, but just a large percentage of the target share overall for Washington. He does lead the slate in yards per route run as well over the last 4 games. Terry McLaurin's the most expensive player on the Washington side of the ball, probably for good reason. So no issues with Terry McLaurin. Definitely would pair him with Alex Smith if you're doing some 4-2 stacks with Washington on that side of the ball. So let's stay on that for a second. Alex Smith, one thing that I guess I have some concerns, especially if you're rolling out Alex Smith captains, is that his completion rate below expectation right now. Pretty astounding, honestly. 4.9 average intended air yards. Some of those efficiency metrics, just not pushing the ball down the field. I just don't know if there's a ton of upside here overall. So I think that's kind of what you need at captain. But obviously, I think he's fine on McLaurin captain teams. I prefer the Dallas players in this Alex Smith price range anyways. Dalton, Amari, Lamb, I think those guys just in a vacuum make better plays overall. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the other pieces in this game. So this has been a very condensed target share overall with McLaurin and Logan Thomas. So Logan Thomas, he's played all but 1 offensive snap over the last 2 games. He's definitely got a nice rapport with Alex Smith. We've seen Alex Smith kind of lock on to tight end in the past. So I think that Logan Thomas is still the one where his volume is very safe, but he could still see an inflated target count relative to just the matchup, relative to if they are able to take away Terry McLaurin on the other side. So I like Logan Thomas a lot, but price considered, guys, I don't expect to have much Logan Thomas in this slate overall. I don't necessarily see him being that strong of a value. I think if you didn't have him in the flex, obviously, we'll put him in here. Logan Thomas, 5,400. I strongly prefer Gallup for 2K less. I think that's a pretty easy value play on the Dallas side of things. So yeah, Logan Thomas, if you're pairing him with Mclaurin teams, pairing him with Alex Smith. He's fine for the ceiling, but ownership based on the value in general, I'm a little bit, I guess, concerned about his price tag overall. Another guy that I'm definitely concerned about the price tag with is Gibson. So 17 touches in back-to-back games. We know that Gibson has been scoring a bunch of touchdowns, but guys, like 400 cheaper than Zeke, unless I'm looking for like a low-owned captain, that would probably be the only kind of route I would want to be involved in, probably being overweight on Gibson. I mean, I guess if you want to play the bullish side of Gibson, he enters this week with 17 plus touches, 3 of the last 4 games. Like I mentioned, he's definitely been scoring touchdowns. We know that 8 over his last 9 games. This Cowboys team has been getting just shredded on the ground in general. So I understand all of that. I just think that he is, in terms of his upside, it's capped by McKissic in so many ways, because McKissic is just going to have such a role in the passing game overall. That said, McKissic at 7K, that's a tougher one to swallow as well. He's definitely going to be a guy that's going to continue to be targeted a lot. I know he saw 4 targets in week 11, but before that, 15, 14 with Smith at the helm. So 7K, I think I'm just doing everything I can in this range to get to a guy like Amari Cooper for 8K. I just think the ceiling is much higher there. I think Amari is way too cheap. So that one's going to be one where I would definitely come hang out with us on Thursday morning once we see where ownership is at. But if Amari is anywhere near the same ownership, I think I still want to be on the Amari side of that one overall. So the Washington passing game, just to kind of recap that, I think it's pretty condensed on Mclaurin, on Logan Thomas. One guy that I think is interesting, I think we can expect some Cam Sims and kind of a mixture of Isaiah Wright and Steven Sims, kind of splitting up the remaining snaps there. So I think of those like cheaper Washington dart throws, I do kind of prefer Steven Sims overall. He's 2,800 if you have him in the flex. Only 3 targets last week, but he did score. So there's a red zone role there. Sometimes it's as simple as just getting that cheap guy that gets in the box that can really make a difference overall. I think that like it all kind of depends on if Dontrell Inman is going to be back this week. It doesn't look like at the time of this video that he will be returning, but if he did, that's just going to muddy the waters even further for some of these guys like Wright, Sims, Cam Sims as well. So keep that in mind as we progress through this. Let's talk a little bit about the Cowboys now, because I think this is like the key to the entire Thanksgiving slate in general, is figuring out which wide receiver it's going to be. So I love the idea of CeeDee Lamb. We mentioned that there's going to be some pressure in this game. I think that there's a chance that Dalton can kind of lock in to Lamb overall. My problem with Lamb is his projection is very close to Amari. So I kind of want to see where ownership is here, because he's actually priced ahead of Cooper at this point. So after what he's been able to do in the red zone lately, obviously that role might be worth the extra 1,200 over Cooper. Depends for sure. Back-to-back games with touchdowns. So the ceiling is there with Lamb for sure. One of the situations that I might prefer is just a low-owned CeeDee Lamb captain versus like the savings you get from Cooper. So I might prefer Cooper more as a flex, as like a complement to Dalton teams or Dallas stacks, and maybe CeeDee Lamb makes a better captain overall. But one of like the glaring values on this slate, it's just Michael Gallup, guys. So I understand that if there's going to be pressure, that Michael Gallup maybe just doesn't have time to let these routes kind of develop down the field. But guys, Gallup, with the targets so spread out, like Gallup's obviously the cheapest. He's 3,400, but he leads this team in weighted opportunity rating, target share, and market share of air yards over the last 4 games. So I think that he's seeing enough valuable targets to where the price difference is so huge here. I love Michael Gallup on this showdown slate for sure. I think if you wanted to get really cheap on the Dallas side, Cedric Wilson, he's 400. So I always want to give you guys at least one of these mega dart throw cheap guys that can kind of make the rest of your team work. I think Wilson's probably the guy on this slate. If you can't get up to Michael Gallup, obviously, that'd be my preference for sure. But I think that Cedric Wilson, I don't see him really just getting you a 0, but it is interesting overall. I guess the last guy we haven't talked about is probably one of the better captains on this slate, Ezekiel Elliott. So one of the better running backs on the Thanksgiving slate overall in terms of touches, the last 3 games, 23, 20, 20 over the last 3. So he's just getting all the volume. Definitely one of the ways that you can kind of combat like a defensive line issue or a lot of pressure coming on Dalton is just to have a very successful run game, right? So he could easily lead this slate in raw points. So firmly in captain consideration for me. Love the Zeke play overall in fantasy this week. I think that they kind of figured out part of their identity is going to be to get Zeke going. Obviously, getting healthier on the offensive line can't hurt. So I think Zeke captains still make a lot of sense. I like the idea if you're rolling out a Dalton captain, just to pair him with 3 of these pass catchers. So you can probably include Zeke in that. But pairing him with at least 2 of the 3, Gallup, Amari, and Lamb, I think that you have to do that with these quarterbacks that don't have any rushing ability. I think they need to be triple stacked overall, personally. I think if I had to pick between one kicker, probably on the Dallas side with Greg Zuerlein, he's 3,600. So he's kind of in that range of like, if you're going to go to like these Sims type of plays or even like a Tony Pollard who hasn't been seeing enough volume for his price tag of 4,400 in my opinion. So probably a little bit thin, but I think the top values probably are Gallup for me in this game and Cedric Wilson if you wanted to go mega cheap. Before we get back at it, want to remind you guys that we do have a Patreon now. So this is where we can continue these conversations that we have during the live streams, during Q&As. We can have them off stream now. So we have an exclusive Discord chat community. There's people in there talking about fantasy football, DFS, sports betting, a large range of people that we can learn from, that we can continue to just build this thing up as a group, as a community. Really important. And we do have, of course, for a little bit of bragging rights, we have a weekly DraftKings tournament. I'm giving away a $30 Amazon gift card to the winner of these because obviously just $1 per month, 25 cents per week, but any of the profits just going right back into the prizes for the group here. So NFL Red Zone Stream Room, that's been a lot of fun as well. Sweat the games as a community. 15 to 30 minute live stream directly before NFL kickoffs. This is something that I'm doing only for the Patreons in Discord. Nowhere else. It's not on YouTube. So get my final thoughts, ask some final questions, hopefully bring you guys some value for a very cheap membership price. Hope to see you guys in there. Continue to grow this community. I would really appreciate all the support. Game number 3, the finale of the Thanksgiving slate. We have Baltimore, who's 6-4, at Pittsburgh, 10-0. So the opening line here has the Steelers as -2.5 favorites at home. They are at a 45.5 over under currently. Pittsburgh at this moment is getting absolutely hammered with bets. 91% of the money right now, only 54% of the bets. So the sharps are definitely on Pittsburgh. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting always to bring up is these divisional unders tend to hit in general. But again, we talked about Washington versus Dallas and game environment and the line of scrimmage. Pittsburgh's defensive line against this Baltimore offensive line, definitely a mismatch in favor of Pittsburgh there. So like what we've seen happen before with Lamar in these situations where he's just under siege, he's just going to be running a ton. So definitely think if you wanted to go to a Lamar captain in this one, I think his upside on the ground is definitely very high. I have some concerns overall that maybe this game turns into kind of a slog fast back and forth, a lot of running. Baltimore plays at the 31st fastest neutral pace. Pittsburgh's kind of middle of the pack, but if Baltimore can have their way here and play the way they want to play, I think that there's a chance that this game might go under. So I think that just on the Baltimore side of the ball, 10th lowest opponent yards per play. So they're really not giving up plays on defense that were big plays in general. They also rank dead last in red zone touchdown rate allowed. So I think if the Steelers can reach the red zone, they have a good shot of turning some of those opportunities into touchdowns. On the other side of it, looking at the Pittsburgh defense, obviously we mentioned this with Desean Watson, man coverage versus zone coverage. They're kind of middle of the pack, so not much to really analyze from that perspective. One area that the Steelers defense has really struggled is the back end of their secondary, which means there could be a handful of opportunities for the Ravens to connect on some deep passes in this one over the course of this game. So I'm going to get this out of the way right away. Marquis Brown. If you wanted to play him as a captain, I still think there's some upside here. I know he had a goose egg last week, but 12.6 ADOT leads the team over the last 4 games. He just dropped a goose egg, like I said, so maybe no one wants to go there. He had 3 targets last week, but I think there's a chance that there could be a decent opportunity for them to connect on a deep one finally. I know I've been going back to this Marquis Brown quite a bit. over the last few weeks, but maybe this is the spot. So you're saying there's a chance. If you didn't want to go the Lamar Jackson or Hollywood Brown captain on the Baltimore side, I think that Gus Edwards is super interesting. Obviously, we see DK Dobbins on the COVID list, tons of COVID, issues with this game overall. So I'm hoping that it happens and we get this game number 3 on the Thanksgiving slate. But Gus Edwards, I understand that his price is still at a spot where he's pretty expensive. But if he's going to touch the ball 15 times in this game, I guess you could still make an argument for Justice Hill as being like a very strong value play. He's only 200 in the flex. So I don't hate that idea. You could probably play both of them together as well and just try and capture the rushing upside outside of Lamar. I think that's a reasonable strategy in general. I think that if you wanted to go to the Pittsburgh side of this game, if we're just looking at kind of the upside in general, I think that Ben Roethlisberger, just pair him with these wide receivers. I know that we did see that Juju got banged up a little bit. He slipped on a flag. That's a tough birthday. Everyone wants to talk about the birthday narrative with Juju last week, but tough spot for him. He is still at a decent price point at 7,600, so I think he's going to be fine. So in general, I don't know why I typed 7,600 in there. In general, Juju, I think, is a decent person, obviously, to pair with Ben Roethlisberger. But then what do we do with Chase Claypool, with Deontay Johnson? Deontay Johnson has been an absolute alpha when he's been healthy the entire game. These last couple of weeks, 16 targets, 10 targets, 10 targets. Like, this guy is just playing that Antonio Brown role. He's going to be peppered by Ben. I think this is a spot where we can definitely look to Deontay captains. I think Deontay and potentially Claypool captains would be my favorite. I think there's a chance that maybe Claypool draws that tougher coverage in this game overall. So super interesting. And we talk about getting to the red zone. I do think that maybe not a captain play, but Eric Ebron at 5,600, I do have a lot of interest in him because I do think that this matchup in particular, if they get down to the red zone, could benefit a guy like that overall. I think if we're looking for like a dart throw, James Washington, he's 1,200. I think that he's still a guy that carries some upside. Just definitely the target share has been a little bit more volatile there overall. But there's been some games. Like last week, he had 3 targets, only played 21 of 70 snaps. The week before, 2 targets, only played 28 of 69 snaps. But he does have a couple games here in the odd game where he'll score a touchdown. That's kind of, like I said before, you kind of have to take some shots on these guys this low on the pricing spectrum at times. So in terms of some other guys that might be decent value options overall, Benny Snell, 1,600. He's another guy that keeps coming in and taking touchdowns. He had 7 attempts last week, only 15 yards, but he did score. So he's 1,600. I think he's the least reasonable on the value side of things as well. I think that if you are going to try and get, somewhat cute on the Baltimore side that I think are interesting in larger field tournaments, wouldn't it be a very Thanksgiving-esque type of thing if Dez Bryant ended up having a decent game here? 5 targets last week, 35 of 65 snaps. So him versus like a Willie Snead type of play. Snead still, his target share is up there. He's 4,800. I don't love the price for him, but back-to-back games with 7 targets for Snead. The thing that I like about Snead, though, is his red zone role. So 3 targets in the red zone last week. The week before, 2 targets in the red zone where he scored twice. So I still think that Snead has a decent amount of upside. Definitely think that maybe Dez Bryant caps that a little bit if they end up kind of splitting up some of those snaps overall. One guy we definitely haven't talked about yet, Mark Andrews. Obviously last week, Andrews kind of gets back on track. Seems to be that safety valve for Lamar. We've seen some decent games come from Andrews. He's leading the slate in target per route run. He's leading the slate in weighted opportunity at the tight end position. So he's a guy that even just back-to-back weeks, averaging 8 targets, maybe not a huge ceiling overall. We just haven't seen the passing go to Hollywood the way that it did last year, where you kind of double stack these guys. So Mark Andrews, super interesting. One of the things I thought was kind of interesting here is his correlation with Marquis Brown all the way down to a 0.09. So I might be avoiding those guys in certain lineups. One thing I'm definitely avoiding is Mark Andrews and Gus the Bus, because I think that they definitely have a very negative correlation in the red zone. So I would probably max one of those guys. In terms of the defenses versus the kickers, that sort of thing, I think the Pittsburgh defense is interesting. they're also very expensive, right? So 5,400 for a defense is probably not a direction I'm going to go. I think if the Baltimore defense at 2,400 is interesting. We've seen Ben blow up in these spots on the road randomly before, so I actually prefer them for a much cheaper price tag. Not really into either of the kickers in this one. Both of them are about 4,400. So I think that's probably it. The top captains for me, I think taking a chance on Hollywood Brown. Of course, Lamar. Of course, Gus the Bus are going to get a ton of work. But I really like these Pittsburgh wide receivers, kind of cycling them through my captains. Hopefully you hit on the right guy. That's going to do it for today, guys. Let me know in the comments who your favorite captain for each game is, and then we'll definitely go through this again on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern time right here on my YouTube channel. We will be live. Come join us. Hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button. Join the Noti-Gang by hitting that bell. Be sure and check out the Patreon if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.